Does anyone actually know what an ADR is? Anyone ever heard of it? Looking at you, Yvonne, have you ever heard of an ADR? No. Okay, cool. So I don't totally know what they are either, so we're going to find out together. So an ADR is what's called an architectural decision record. And in the singular form, an ADR is a single record, but it's also a record of a collection of architecturally significant decisions. So these are like, if you change something in your application or your service or whatever you're doing, whatever you're building, it doesn't even have to be a software project. An ADR describes why you've made a decision about an architectural change. And so some things that we use ADRs for are, just kidding, we don't actually use ADRs. Like, none of you have ever heard of it. I have never really used ADRs. I don't think they're super popular, and it's not really like built into any existing processes. But what could we use them for? They could be super useful. So here's my 5 truths about software development. The first is the docs are terrible. The second is no one actually ever reads the docs. Third, code is rarely actually self-documenting. Fourth, it's never actually really clear why a certain amount of code exists. And 5, the docs are still terrible. So RFCs are pretty nice. We use RFCs at Pickwell. It's a pretty good process. It's a venue for proposing a change. If you don't know what RFC stands for, it's request for comments. So it's literally a venue for saying, hey, I have an idea to change something. Here's some possibilities. And then it's also a means to like collect input. You're like actually literally collecting comments on what you're proposing. And it's a good way to propose multiple ideas. If you say like, hey, I think we should solve this problem. I'm not really sure how to do it. Here's an option A, B, C. RFCs let people weigh in on what they think is the best option. So RFCs are great, but RFCs are also terrible because RFCs are not documentation, right? They're, by their very definition, they're just a request for comments. It's just a way to collect comments. And RFCs are just that. They're just the proposed change and the comments, and they never actually usually get finished. Like, I know that we use RFCs to describe like the internet, right? Like we have an RFC that describes HTTP and it gets superseded, et cetera. So those RFCs get finished, but usually in practice, like you produce an RFC, you're just trying to get comments on making a decision, and then someone's gonna go and make that decision. RFCs are usually kind of big too, right? Like you just want to get every possible idea out there so that people can weigh in on what the best one is and give their opinions. And then there's also tons and tons of comments on RFCs. And that makes them huge. And huge docs are also terrible because, like I said before, well, large documents are also hard to write. There's a lot of writing to do. They're pretty much never read. The longer it is, the less likely you are to read it. They're hard to update if they're large, and they usually get out of date pretty quickly if they have a lot of content in them. So let's talk about how like we as developers actually make architectural decisions. So maybe, if we're lucky, we make an RFC, which is great. It's the first step. And then someone looks at the result of the RFC, all the comments and all the proposals, and takes sort of like a general consensus about what has happened. And then maybe somebody totally else interprets that consensus, and then they implement it. And then we're done. Like we did what we said we wanted to do in the RFC, and it's done. It's like shipped. It's out in production. That's great. But how do you like record these architectural decisions? Well, you might say like, oh, like the RFC is good enough. Like we described what we were going to do in there, and then we did it. So that's probably right. But the RFC is not good enough, right? For the reasons I mentioned before, like it's just a bunch of proposed changes. It doesn't get finished. It's not polished. It's not actually like a record. It's like a proposal. And then the last question is, how do you like follow architectural decisions? And by this I mean, how do you like figure out what decisions have been made before you and why they were made? And RFCs are really kind of bad for this because they don't actually tell you what the end decision was. You have to sort of look at the RFC and see what was proposed, and then look at the code and figure out what actually got implemented, and then maybe you can like understand from that like what the architectural decision was. So maybe some other developer made a decision about your application. You can either like blindly accept a decision, say, oh, he had a pretty good idea, I guess. I mean, everything seems to be working, so I'll just do whatever he did or she did. Or you can blindly change that decision, say, well, I don't understand it, I disagree with it, so I'm going to do something completely different because I don't know what they were thinking when they did that. Or you can do a third thing, which is like wander through outdated docs and old emails and chat archives and then just do one of the first two. So there must be a better way. And the better way to do this is architectural decision records. So architecture, and this is for a change. An ADR is only for a change in your architecture, right? So this is things like we are switching from Python to Python 3 from Python 2. Or like we're replacing our logging system with a new service. Or we're going to build a new tool to frobnicate the BizBaz. It's not for things like we are going to start using tabs instead of spaces, right? This isn't an architectural decision. It doesn't change the architecture of your application. This is like a code style thing, right? Or we are going to stop writing huge RFCs. This is like a process about your development style. It's not a change to your architecture. Or we're going to roll stand-ups, backlog estimation, review, and retro into one big 4-hour-long meeting, right? That's also about your development process. That's not an architectural decision. And architectural decisions are not necessarily client-facing, right? Like they could just be internal things, like, but they might be client-facing. So maybe it's you want to do something to increase performance, or maybe you just want to do something to make it nicer for your developers to work in your code base. Both of those could be considered architectural decisions. So it's not really just, is this for the client or not for the client? Is it just internal? It could be either. They usually just solve a problem with or improve some aspect of the architecture. So it's just going to make a change to the architecture. D is for decision. So this is, an ADR describes the decision that was made as a result of an RFC or some other means of like collecting input on a change. So for example, this might be, we are going to replace the closed source service with our own open source implementation. This is like what we're going to do. Or after doing some sophisticated analysis, we decided that Perl 6 is 120% more than Perl 5, which is more. So here we're like documenting, maybe that's a bad example actually, but we're documenting decisions and not like the state of things. The quickest way for your documentation to get out of date is to just document state, because state is constantly going to be changing, right? And the last thing is record. So these are historical documents, right? They are not going to change after they're created, with one small caveat. And they're especially good for disparate teams, right? So like if you're not on a team and they make an architectural decision, you might want to understand why they made that decision. Regardless of what they're currently doing now, at one point they made a decision like the mobile team uses React Native and not something else. Like, why did they do that? This is a way to sort of codify those decisions in a way that anyone can interpret and process. And like I said, they will never change once they're created, but they can be superseded, which is the small caveat. So let's talk about how to write an ADR. First, get init. We want to put this stuff in version control. Even though I said it's not going to change, right? Like you still want a centralized place for people to review it. And you kind of also want people that are not developers to be able to look at it too. So we're going to make a directory like docs, ADRs, and we're going to make it a markdown file so that we can actually render it into something that looks nice. And we're going to name it like ADR-001. That's going to be the first ADR. And we'll give it 6 sections. So this is just like what I think is a good idea, but you're welcome to put whatever sections you want in. So these are the sections. There's a title, TLDR, context, decision, consequences, and status. So first, the title. The title should be really short and to the point. So here's the examples from above. Adopting Python 3, replacing logging with LogFume, building a frobnicator. Like these are going to be really obvious to the person reading it what their decision they're describing. And next there should be a TLDR, too long didn't read, which your ADR shouldn't be too long to read, but it's still good to like put a summary right at the top so people know they're looking at the right thing. So it's just describes the action in the simplest possible ways. We decided to upgrade to Python 3 to support Unicode better. That's it. That's the summary. And they should be short and concise. The next section is context. So you want to kind of like load into the developer's mind the relevant and relative context at the point that the decision was made. So this is documenting state, but it needs to be related to when that actual decision was made. So it's okay to say like, we were doing this, 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 and this. That's never going to be out of date because at that point in time, those things were what was happening. That documentation is correct. It's not saying that this is the current state of the system. It's saying that was the state of the system when we were considering this change. So it's something like, we are currently using Python 2 everywhere, right? So at the point in that document was created, that is what the state of the system was. And then other external forces can come into play here too. Like And now the client wants to start sending us Unicode characters. So these are external forces that aren't necessarily about the state of the system, but things that are weighing in on it. And these eventually actually should become out of date, right? Like you should be changing things in your architecture. The state should change, but still they're contextually relevant. The next section is the decision, and this is the meat of the ADR, the D in ADR, right? This is going to be like full sentences, active voice. We will migrate from Python 3 for services X, Y, and Z, right? It's going to be maybe a paragraph or two describing exactly what needs to be done to make the decision like in effect, and that's pretty much all the decision section is. Next is consequences, right? Like what is going to happen as a result of this decision being made. So these are all consequences, not just now we can support Unicode better, but like everything that might go wrong, not just the benefits, right? Anything that could happen. And the thing about this is these consequences are likely to become the context for the next ADR, right? So if you can sort of like figure out what the consequences of a certain decision are, they're maybe going to set you up for the next decision that you have to make. And the last thing is status. So your ADR is either going to be proposed, it's going to be accepted, or deprecated and superseded. So deprecated just means that decision is no longer relevant anymore. Superseded means we made that decision, but we've replaced that decision with a new one. So this is the only time that you're going to go back and modify your ADR is to update the status. Especially if you supersede it, you're going to want to tell the person reading the decision, hey, yeah, we made this decision at one point, but we made another decision. You're probably going to want to read this ADR as well. So in my opinion, ADRs are a healthy, they have a good relationship with agile development. So the idea is just that not all decisions can be made up front, right? You can't make all the decisions about your application before you even build it. So ADRs sort of like happily go along with this idea of like an iterative approach. And this process for making decisions can like be iterative as well. And like because ADRs can supersede each other and they only are relevant to the context when they're created, they can build on top of each other too, right? So the last thing I want to mention is you could actually, if you like ADRs, you could take it a step further with APOs. So in the Perl community, they have APOs. And APO stands for apocalypse, which I'd never heard of. Ryan like showed me an article and Brian clued me in about what it meant. And this is a quote from Larry talking about playing God, and basically he's saying, you know, this is, I get the impression that apocalypse is kind of like an ADR, but it's sort of just like, I mean, it's like a historical document, but they're more of like a motivation for a change rather than the result of an actual decision being made. But it's a way for Larry to just sort of be like, these are things that are changing or going to happen, like look out for this, that kind of stuff. At least that's my interpretation of it. So thanks. That's ADRs. Any questions?
Who uses the device?
I have no idea. Yeah, I have. I found a post that someone was talking about ADRs, and I looked up what they were, and you know, it's like kind of maybe a known development process to go along with RFCs, but yeah, I don't have an example of someone that like actively uses ADRs. And so I can't really like tell you that they're gonna like solve these problems of like context and figuring out like why a decision or change was made, but it seems pretty useful, especially with the RFC process. I wish Dan was here because I think he could really chime in on the RFC process, but if you have used RFCs for development, they are kind of terrible as documentation. Like you can't really look back at them and figure out what was going on with the RFC because sometimes what actually happens is wildly different than what was proposed. So the ADRs sort of try to be a better historical record.
The apocalypses were like a way of getting consensus. There were too many RFCs.
They're like a mother of all RFCs. Yeah. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone.